Many people today believe that had Japan not provoked the United States in 1941, its eventual defeat might not have been so catastrophic. Perhaps Japan could have prolonged its resistance. Perhaps its collapse would not have come so swiftly. Thus, the attack on Pearl Harbor is often portrayed as the Japanese military's greatest strategic blunder during the Second World War. But was this really the case? In reality, Japan's decision to strike Pearl Harbor was, in many ways, an act of desperation. Had Japan refrained from attacking the United States and abandoned its southward expansion plan, it might not have lasted anywhere near 1945. When examining the reasons behind Japan's defeat, the issue of resources is unavoidable. Japan was a nation with limited territory and extremely scarce natural resources, a structural constraint that shaped its entire modern history. At the outset of the war in China, Japan publicly proclaimed that it could defeat China within 3 months. This was less a reflection of military confidence than an acknowledgement of Japan's economic limitations. In the view of the Japanese High Command, if China could not be subdued quickly, Japan's national strength would not sustain a long war. Although the occupation of Manchuria provided Japan with coal, iron, copper, and other strategic materials, crucial resources such as oil and rubber still depended overwhelmingly on imports from the United States. In 1937 alone, Japanese imports from the U.S. exceeded $100 million. Oil, refined petroleum, scrap iron, and raw cotton accounted for $140 million. By 1939, over 85% of Japan's oil supply came from the United States. This meant that Washington effectively controlled Japan's economic lifeline. If the U.S. imposed an oil embargo, Japan's war machine would grind to a halt. Its planes, cannons, and warships would instantly become useless steel. With the war dragging on, Japan's finances deteriorated rapidly. Military spending soared. In 1937, out of a national budget of 3.4 billion yen, 43% went directly to the military. By 1938, military expenditures alone reached 5.3 billion yen, surpassing Japan's entire 1937 budget. To sustain the war, Tokyo raised taxes and issued massive amounts of war bonds. Corporate income tax was increased by 80%, personal income tax by 30%, inheritance tax by 10%, and new property taxes were introduced. The government imposed wartime controls on materials, revealing that Japan's economy was nearing crisis. Thus, Japan's only solution was to expand the war further to seize more foreign resources to fuel its military. This approach was known in Japan as using war to sustain war, a strategy of feeding one campaign with resources plundered from another. At this critical juncture, the Japanese military faced two strategic options. 1. The northern expansion, an army-led plan to strike the Soviet Union and seize Siberian oil and gas resources. 2. The southern expansion, a navy-led plan to advance into Southeast Asia to seize rubber, oil, and other resources, an approach that would inevitably threaten American interests. In the winter of 1939, the Japanese army launched a probing attack against Soviet-backed Mongolian forces along the Khalkhin-Gol-Namanghan region. On May 1939, clashes escalated dramatically when the Soviet Union intervened under the terms of the Soviet-Mongolian Mutual Assistance Pact. The conflict became a full-fledged battle. On June 18, Marshal Georgy Zhukov assumed command of the Soviet 57th Special Corps. He assembled a powerful combined arms force, equipped with tanks, aircraft, and heavy artillery far superior to anything the Japanese army could field. Soviet artillery alone expended 31,000 tons of shells, whereas Japanese total material consumption did not even reach 2,000 tons. The result was a crushing defeat for Japan. The elite Kwantung Army was devastated. Senior officers of the 23rd Division, its infantry and artillery commanders, were all killed. 35 officers above the rank of major died in battle. Following the defeat, General Ueda Kenkichi resigned as commander of the Kwantung Army, while frontline commander Komatsu Bara Mishiter committed ritual suicide. The The loss forced Tokyo to confront an uncomfortable truth: Japan was no match for the Soviet Union. To make matters worse, midway through the conflict, Germany, Japan's supposed ally, signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Soviet Union. This not only killed the strategy of a two-front assault on the USSR but also left Japan feeling betrayed. Consequently, Japan signed the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact, effectively abandoning the northern expansion strategy. Left with no other viable path to secure resources, Japan committed itself fully to the southern expansion. In July 1941, Japan advanced into southern French Indochina. This directly threatened American interests in the Pacific. The United States, having recently emerged from the Great Depression, responded forcefully. On July 25th, it froze all Japanese assets and imposed a full oil embargo. By the eve of the Pearl Harbor attack, the U.S. embargo had reduced Japan's accessible oil reserves to the equivalent of 2 years of wartime consumption. This meant that without drastic action, Japan's defeat was not a possibility, it was a certainty. Japan now faced two choices. 1. Submit to the United States, withdraw from China and Indochina, and accept national humiliation and economic collapse. 2. Go to war, seize the oil and rubber of Southeast Asia, and confront the United States directly. The first option guaranteed defeat. The second offered only a slim chance of survival, but it was still a chance. Thus, Tokyo chose the latter. Given that war with the United States was now inevitable, Japan had to confront the U.S. Pacific Fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, who had once served as naval attaché in Washington and understood America's industrial might, knew the risks well. He strongly opposed war with the U.S., but once the decision was made, he insisted, if we must fight, we must strike first. Japan's strategy became clear: a preemptive strike to cripple the U.S. Navy and buy the time needed to complete its southward conquests. From the moment Japan began its aggressive expansion across Asia, its eventual defeat was already written. All it could hope for was to delay the inevitable. On December 7, 1941, in the early hours of a Sunday morning, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers approached Hawaii under strict radio silence. Over 350 aircraft took off, catching the U.S. Pacific Fleet completely off guard. Within minutes, Pearl Harbor was engulfed in flames. The United States suffered devastating losses. 5 battleships damaged or sunk, over a dozen other vessels hit, 188 aircraft destroyed, more than 6,400 casualties. Simultaneously, Japan launched a broader offensive across the Pacific, rapidly seizing Southeast Asia and much of the Southwest Pacific. The oil and rubber obtained from these territories temporarily revived Japan's war machine and allowed it to remain militarily dominant during the war's early phase. For half a year, the United States was forced onto the defensive, precisely the breathing room Japan had hoped to gain. What if Japan had not attacked Pearl Harbor? If Japan had avoided war with the United States, several alternative outcomes might have emerged. 1. Germany could have focused entirely on the Soviet Union, potentially dragging the USSR into a prolonged struggle. 2. Without American pressure in the Pacific, Japan might have joined Germany in a pincer attack on the Soviet Union, fulfilling its long-desired dream of seizing Siberian resources. 3. Without U.S. involvement, the war in Asia would have continued far longer. China, divided between the nationalists and communists, would have faced an even more protracted conflict. In short, without the Pearl Harbor attack, Japan would not have lost so quickly. This is an uncomfortable but historically plausible scenario, yet history allows no what if. Japan never imagined that the United States would develop and use the atomic bomb. It never foresaw the total collapse of its navy by 1944. And it never expected that, by war's end, unconditional surrender would be the only option left. Conclusion: a decision born of desperation. From today's perspective, the attack on Pearl Harbor appears irrational, even suicidal, but within Japan's strategic logic of the time, it was a painfully rational choice. Submitting to American demands meant certain defeat. Striking first offered a narrow, fleeting chance at survival. Japan's leaders believed they were choosing the lesser of two evils. Admiral Yamamoto, who understood America better than any Japanese officer, opposed the war but nonetheless executed the attack because he knew that once the decision was made, Pearl Harbor was the only viable opening move. In hindsight, it was a tragic gamble, one that accelerated Japan's destruction. Yet given Japan's resource crisis, its geopolitical isolation, and its uncompromising ideology, the attack was, for its leaders, not madness but inevitability. History is unchangeable. What matters is that nations learn from it and that future strength is built not on desperation, but on wisdom.